It had been a few months since the new neighbor moved in next door. At first, I didn't think much of it. Our old neighbors, the Millers, were never exactly friendly. But compared to this guy, I'd take their awkward small talk any day. It started with the van. Just this beat-up white van parked in the driveway one day. My wife, Claire, and I figured we'd be good neighbors and introduce ourselves. We knocked on the door, but no one answered. Strange, since the van was right there. We shrugged it off. Maybe they were asleep or in the shower. Our bedroom overlooks their backyard, which has this old detached garage. For days, the van would disappear during the day and show up late at night. One evening, Claire and I were reading in bed when we heard the garage door creak open. Curiosity got the better of us. We peeked through the blinds and saw him, a middle-aged guy in a white t-shirt and jeans, hauling boxes from the van into the garage. The motion light flickered on, casting this eerie glow over the whole scene. We stopped watching before it felt too invasive. A few nights later, the scraping started, metallic grating noises, like something being dragged across the garage floor. Then there were the occasional bangs, boxes being dropped maybe. But that scraping sound, it didn't stop. I went to the window, careful not to make noise, and looked out. This time, he caught me. His head snapped up, and he stared right at me. I froze, then stepped back. A few seconds later, the garage door slammed shut. I told Claire I was going to go over and say hi, try to smooth things over. I threw on some shorts and a t-shirt and headed outside. By the time I got to the driveway, he was already in the van, engine running. He backed out so fast I barely had time to step aside. The tires screeched as he disappeared down the street. The whole thing left me uneasy. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling something was not right. I went into his backyard, drawn by the thumping sounds coming from the garage. It sounded like something, or someone was in there. Claire called my name from our window. "What are you doing?" she hissed. I shushed her and tried the garage door, but it was locked. I went back inside, but sleep didn't come easy. Later, Claire shook me awake. "I heard the gate open," she whispered. I told her she was imagining things, but she insisted. I grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs. The neighbor's yard was dark, but ours, I heard footsteps. Someone was out there. I flipped on the backyard lights just in time to see a shadow dart toward the side of the house. The gate slammed shut. I chased after them, but by the time I reached the street, they were gone. The next day, I went to talk to Gene, the guy 2 doors down. He hadn't met the new neighbor either, but he'd been hearing strange noises too. We agreed to keep an eye out and text each other if anything else happened. A few days later, I was opening the blinds in the living room when I saw him. He was standing in his window, staring right at me. Not moving, not blinking, just staring. I waved, but he didn't react. Claire came over, but by then, he was gone. We decided to confront him. Claire and I went next door and knocked. No answer. I rang the bell, then knocked again, harder this time. From inside, there was a loud slam like something heavy hitting the floor, but no one came to the door. Gene texted me later that night. He'd heard crying, muffled but unmistakable. We went over together the next day, but the house was silent. The van was gone, and it hasn't been back since. It's been 2 weeks now. Claire and I keep waking up in the middle of the night, convinced we hear noises outside. Every time I check the window, but the driveway is empty. None of us even know his name. Whatever's going on, it's not right. I think it's time to call someone, anonymously of course, for peace of mind. Because whatever's in that garage, I don't think I want to know. A couple of years ago, my partner Jamie and I finally moved in together and bought our first house. We knew the neighborhood wasn't the best, but the house had been recently renovated, and it was within our budget. Within the first few weeks, though, we realized our neighbors were unusual, to put it mildly. The couple next door, a man and woman who looked to be in their late 40s, were the kind of people who kept to themselves. Whenever we tried to strike up a conversation, just a friendly hello or a comment about the weather, they'd respond with short, clipped answers and quickly retreat inside. It was clear they weren't interested in being neighborly, which was fine, I guess. But there were other things that made us uneasy. Their house seemed to have a constant stream of visitors. Different cars would come and go at all hours, and we'd see strangers entering or leaving their property. It was like they were running some kind of Airbnb, but we never saw any luggage or heard any chatter about rentals. It was just odd. One evening close to sunset, Jamie and I were sitting on our back patio, enjoying the cool breeze after a warm day. Out of nowhere, a man we'd never seen before walked up to the fence separating our yards. He was tall, with a lanky build, and he introduced himself with a casual, "Hey there, how's it going?" It was strange because no one from next door ever acknowledged us, let alone started a conversation. We chatted for a few minutes, just small talk about the weather and how nice the day had been. He didn't mention how he knew our neighbors or where he was from, which struck me as a little odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. What did stick with me, though, was how he kept complimenting our house. "You've got a beautiful place here," he said more than once. "And you two seem like such a lovely couple." It was flattering. But something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. Later that night, Jamie and I were in the kitchen when we noticed a flickering light coming from the backyard. We peeked out the window and froze. The same man we'd talked to earlier was sitting in one of our patio chairs, calmly tending a fire in our fire pit. My heart raced. "What the hell is he doing?" Jamie whispered. I opened the window and called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, can you put that out and leave, please?" He looked up at us, his face lit by the firelight, and grinned. "Come on down, let's sit together. I just want to get to know you better." We didn't move. After about 15 minutes, he finally left, putting out the fire before he disappeared into the night. We thought that was the end of it. But then, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard a knock at the back door. We both knew who it was. Sure enough, when we looked through the window, there he was, standing on our porch with the fire poker in his hand, his face with anger, and he started shouting, demanding we come outside and join him. Before we could react, he began slamming the poker into our screen door, tearing it apart. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. One of the cars from next door was missing too. The officers spoke to our neighbors, who gave a quick, almost robotic apology the next morning. "Sorry about that," the man said. "Not meeting our eyes. It won't happen again." And just like that, they walked away, as distant as ever. They paid to fix the screen door, and we never saw the tall man again. But the strange comings and goings at their house continued. Jamie and I kept to ourselves after that, always locking the doors and glancing over our shoulders when we were outside. We never found out who that man was or why he'd fixated on us. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that something about that house and those neighbors wasn't right. I had been living in my apartment for nearly a year when I first noticed something was off. It wasn't anything glaring, just small, subtle things that I couldn't quite explain. I'd come home from work and find the blinds in the living room slightly open, even though I was certain I'd closed them before leaving. Sometimes the bathroom light would be on, though I could have sworn I'd turned it off that morning. I brushed it off as forgetfulness. Life was busy, and living alone made it easy to overlook the little things. But over time, those little things started to add up. One evening, after a particularly long shift, I came home to find the front door slightly ajar. Not enough to scream break-in, but just enough to send a cold shiver down my spine. I stood on the doorstep, staring at the door, trying to convince myself I'd simply forgotten to close it all the way that morning. My neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people didn't bother locking their doors. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The apartment was silent, just as I'd left it. Everything seemed normal, but that nagging unease clung to me like a shadow. I checked the windows, double-checked the locks, and told myself it was probably just exhaustion. Maybe I had left the door open. I was always rushing in the mornings. But a few days later, it happened again. This time, I was positive I'd locked the door. I remembered standing in the hallway, keys in hand, turning the deadbolt before heading to work. Yet when I got home that evening, the door was unlocked. My stomach dropped as I stood there, my pulse quickening. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the lock was faulty. Maybe I hadn't turned it all the way. I stepped inside cautiously, my senses on high alert, listening for anything out of place. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. I walked through each room, checking the windows, the back door, trying to convince myself nothing was wrong. That's when I noticed it. The drawer in the kitchen where I kept my utensils was slightly open. Not wide open, just enough to show someone had been rifling through it. I froze. I'd been in a hurry that morning, but there was no way I'd left it like that. I always closed the drawers before leaving. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the counter. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the feeling of violation was impossible to shake. Someone had been in my apartment. As the days went on, the strange occurrences continued. I'd come home to find things slightly out of place. A chair pulled away from the table. A book moved from its usual spot. The shower curtain pushed to the side when I was sure I'd left it closed. It was like someone was going through my things but never taking anything, just disturbing the order of my home. I became paranoid. Every time I left for work, I'd check and recheck the locks, close every window, draw the curtains tight. I even started placing small objects in strategic places so I'd know if someone had been inside. It wasn't long before I started suspecting my neighbor Tom. He lived across the hall, and while he seemed friendly enough, there was something about him that made me uneasy. He was always around, tinkering in the hallway, taking out the trash, or just sitting on the stairs, watching the comings and goings of the building. He had a way of making small talk that felt intrusive, like he knew more about me than he should. He'd comment on when I left for work, when I came home, when I had friends over. At first, I thought he was just being neighborly, but now I wasn't so sure. One evening, I came home to find the lights in my bedroom on. I never left them on, not even when I was in a rush. My heart raced as I slowly made my way through the apartment, checking each room, trying to stay calm. Everything was where it should be, except for the bedroom. There, on my nightstand, was a small trinket I didn't recognize, a keychain with a tiny compass attached. It wasn't mine. I hadn't bought it, and I hadn't had anyone over in weeks. I stared at it, my mind racing. Had Tom been in my apartment? Was he messing with me? The thought made my skin crawl. I grabbed the keychain and marched across the hall, adrenaline surging through me. Tom was sitting on the stairs, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I approached, a lazy smile spreading across his face. "Evening," he said, leaning back. "Everything okay?" I held up the keychain. "Did you leave this in my apartment?" Tom glanced at it, his expression blank for a moment, then he chuckled. "No idea what you're talking about." "Someone's been in my apartment," I said, my voice with anger. "And I think it's you." He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Whoa, calm down. I don't know what's going on in your place, but it's not me. Maybe you're just forgetting things. Stress can do that, you know." I wanted to believe him, but the smirk on his face, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long, told me everything I needed to know. The next day, I bought security cameras. If Tom was breaking into my apartment, I was going to catch him. I installed them around the perimeter, making sure every angle was covered. That night, I slept with my phone next to me, ready to check the footage if anything happened. For a few nights, everything was quiet. No signs of entry, no missing items, nothing out of place. I started to relax, thinking maybe I'd scared Tom off by confronting him. But then, one night, the motion detector on the cameras went off. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting me awake. I grabbed it, my heart racing as I opened the app to check the footage. The grainy video feed showed the hallway outside my apartment. The shadows stretched long and dark, and then I saw Tom. He was crouched near my door, fiddling with the lock. I was in fear and rage as I watched him. He'd been doing this all along. I dialed 911 as I explained the situation to the operator. As I spoke, I kept my eyes on the feed, watching as Tom finally managed to pick the lock. He slipped inside, moving with a practiced ease, like he'd done it 100 times before. I didn't wait. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and crept down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. How dare he come into my home, my space, and act like he owned it? I heard him before I saw him, his footsteps soft on the carpet as he made his way through the apartment. He was in the kitchen, his back turned to me, rummaging through the drawers. Without thinking, I swung the bat. It connected with a sickening thud, and Tom crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. I stood over him, shaking, adrenaline coursing through me as the sound of sirens approached in the distance. The police arrived within minutes, pulling Tom to his feet and slapping handcuffs on him. I stood in the doorway, watching as they led him out to the squad car. He didn't say a word, just glared at me with those cold, calculating eyes. The officers took my statement, reviewed the footage, and confirmed what I already knew. Tom had been breaking into my apartment for weeks, maybe even longer. He was charged with trespassing and breaking and entering. Even after Tom was arrested, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I changed the locks, added more cameras, and installed a security system. My apartment, once a place of safety, now felt like a cage, a place where I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next invasion. I moved out a few months later. I live in a quiet suburban town in New Jersey. My girlfriend, Emily, and I recently moved into a small house that's perfect for 2 people, maybe even 4 if we ever needed the space. The house has a decent-sized backyard, and our street is so quiet you can hear the leaves rustling at night. On one side of our property, there's a water drainage basin, basically just a cluster of trees surrounding a sunken area. On the other side is our neighbor, Greg, who's in his late 60s and lives with his wife. They keep to themselves, which we appreciate. Directly across the street is a small patch of woods that leads to another drainage basin. It's private, peaceful, and exactly what we wanted. But then there's the backyard. Greg's house is mostly blocked off by overgrown bushes our landlord planted years ago, so the only house that has a clear view into our yard is the one directly behind us, just over the fence. And that house, that one house, has been the source of everything unsettling that's happened since we moved in. It's fall now, and we've been spending weekends cleaning up the yard, raking leaves, and getting things ready for winter. A few weeks ago, I started noticing something strange. Every time we were outside, there were two people, a middle-aged man and woman, standing at the upstairs window of the house behind us. They'd just stand there staring, not moving, not smiling, just watching. At first, we tried to ignore it, but it got to the point where Emily refused to go into the yard anymore. She was too creeped out. One foggy afternoon, I was out raking leaves when I looked up and saw them again standing in that same window. I decided to wave just to see if they'd react. I smiled, waved, and waited. Nothing. They didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge me at all. I could feel their eyes on me, though, like they were studying every move I made. I turned away, trying to focus on the leaves, but after a few minutes I glanced back. They were still there, still staring. That's when Emily suggested we go over and introduce ourselves. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but she convinced me it might ease the tension. We walked around the block to their house and rang the doorbell. We expected one of the two people from the window to answer, but instead, the door cracked open just enough to reveal half of a young guy's face. He couldn't have been older than 25. The house was pitch black behind him, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. "Hi," Emily said, forcing a smile. "We're your neighbors. Just wanted to introduce ourselves." The guy didn't say anything at first. He just stared at us with this blank expression, like we were interrupting something important. Finally, he muttered, "What do you need?" I tried to keep it light. "Oh, nothing. We just noticed there's a man and woman who are always at your upstairs window. Are they your parents?" He frowned. "I don't know who you're talking about." Emily and I exchanged a look. Before we could say anything else, he shut the door. Not all the way, though. He left it cracked, just enough to keep watching us as we walked away. When we got home, I went upstairs to our bedroom. Our house only has one upstairs room, the master bedroom, with two windows. One of them looks out toward that house. I pulled back the blinds and saw them again, the man and woman standing in the window, staring right at me. Even from this distance, I could feel their gaze. I shut the blinds and went downstairs to tell Emily. We agreed we needed to plant something tall to block their view, but it was already too late in the season. We'd have to wait until spring. A few nights later, we were in bed when we heard a knocking sound downstairs. I told Emily to stay put while I went to check it out. The knocking grew louder as I got closer to the living room. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the backyard window. The blinds were shut, but I could see the shadow of a fist tapping against the glass. I froze, too scared to say anything. Instead, I flipped on the backyard light, and the knocking stopped. I didn't dare look outside. I just went back upstairs and told Emily I'd scared whoever it was off. I didn't want to admit how terrified I was. It's been 2 weeks since then, and we haven't seen the man and woman in the window. But last night we heard yelling coming from that house. It was so loud we could hear it through our closed windows. Emily and I almost called the police, but then it stopped as suddenly as it started. Everything went quiet again. This happened to me when I was only 10 years old. Back then, I lived in a pretty remote part of the US. The nearest houses were at least half a mile apart. So while my family had met a few of our neighbors, most of them were strangers. That included the man who lived in the house to the left of ours. I don't remember his name, but he was elderly, and creepy to say the least. All the windows in his house were covered with some kind of dark film, so you couldn't see inside, and his yard was completely overgrown. I knew this because every weekday, I had to walk past his house on my way home from school. Every time I walked by, he'd either be standing on his porch, watching me, or trying to strike up a conversation. It got to the point where I dreaded walking home just because I knew I'd have to pass him. But that wasn't even the worst part. Maybe once or twice a month, he'd make the half-mile walk to our house in the middle of the night. He'd shine a flashlight into my bedroom window. I knew it was him because one time, I actually saw him walking down the road toward our house, flashlight in hand. Looking back, this was beyond alarming, but at the time, I thought the best way to handle it was to ignore it. I didn't tell my parents. I even convinced myself it wasn't a big deal because my room was on the second floor, so it's not like he could see much anyway. Then, one summer night, I was woken up by the familiar beam of a flashlight shining through my window. But this time, it was followed by a soft thud against the side of the house. All I could think was how much it sounded like a ladder being propped up against the wall. A few moments later, there was a knock on the window. I looked over, and there he was, his face pressed against the glass, smiling, gesturing for me to open the window. I screamed and ran to my parents' room. I tried to explain, my voice shaking, that the neighbor was outside my window. They rushed to my room, but of course, he was gone by then. The worst part, they didn't believe me. They said I must have been dreaming or seeing things. They never called the police. Even now, as an adult, I know what I saw. I try not to think about what his intentions might have been toward a 10-year-old kid. I never saw him again after that night. In fact, less than a week later, his house had a for sale sign out front. To me, that was all the proof I needed. I've lived in plenty of places since then, but not one neighbor has ever come close to being as creepy as that man. I live alone in a house I bought about 6 months ago. It's not a fancy neighborhood, but it's not rough either, just average. Most of the neighbors I've met have been friendly, though I haven't met everyone. Everything had been quiet and uneventful until a few weeks ago, when something happened. It was late, around 11 p.m. I was sitting on the couch in my living room, scrolling through my phone, when the doorbell rang. Not once, but 3 or 4 times in quick succession. My heart jumped. Who would be at my door this late? I got up, walked to the door, and peeked through the window. No one was there. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, scanning the yard and the street. Nothing. I went back inside. But less than a minute later, there was a loud knock on the door. This time, it wasn't the doorbell. It was a hard knock that made the wood rattle. I rushed back, opened the door, but again, no one was there. I told myself that maybe it was kids playing a prank. I waited by the door for a few minutes, but no one came back. I tried to shake it off and returned to the living room. About 10 minutes later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just the door. There was a loud bang on the front window, like someone had slammed their fist against the glass. I bolted from the couch, my heart pounding, and ran to the door. By the time I got there, I caught a glimpse of 3 figures sprinting down my driveway and into the street. They looked like grown men. My first thought was that it was just a stupid prank, but the way one of them had hit the window, it felt off. Too aggressive. I waited, tense, but nothing else happened for a while. I started to think they were done, but then, just as I was about to relax, it got worse. There was another knock, louder than before, and then the sound of glass shattering. I ran to the door and saw the window in the front door had been smashed. Shards of glass littered the floor. Anger surged through me, and I flung the door open, stepping outside. The same 3 men were running down the street, laughing. I didn't think, I just ran after them. They were fast, but I saw them duck into a house at the end of the block. I marched up to the house. It was the worst one on the street, peeling paint, overgrown yard, a broken down car in the driveway. I knocked on the door, hard. No answer. I knocked again, louder. "I know you're in there," I shouted. Finally, I heard a voice from inside, muffled but angry. "Go away!" "You broke my window," I yelled back. There was silence for a moment, and then I heard movement from the side of the house. I turned just in time to see a shadowy figure in the yard. Before I could react, something whizzed past my head and hit a bush. A rock. Another one flew toward me, missing me by inches and smacking the side of the house. I didn't wait for a third. I turned and ran, their laughter echoing behind me. When I got back to my house, I called the police. They arrived quickly, and I showed them the broken window and explained what had happened. They went to the house at the end of the street. Turns out, 5 adults lived there, most of them addicts. The cops found drugs inside, and one guy tried to run. They arrested several people, and I pressed charges for the broken window and the rocks they threw at me. Not long after, the house was sold to new owners who cleaned the place up,